Hello and welcome to ShipCon training and to the presentation on autism and person-centered planning, which is being developed by a European project, including the countries of North Macedonia, Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, and Cyprus. And altogether, we've put together training on person-centered planning and with a specific leaning toward autism spectrum disorders and the difficulties of actually carrying out planning for life if people have autism. So we're going to be particularly focusing on that area of it, but also looking at the process of person-centered planning, how we carry that out, and the things we need to think about. The course is broken into several units. So in this unit, we're going to be particularly looking at the history and development of person-centered planning and how that actually relates to people with disability in general. So we refer to person-centered planning in short as PCP. And it's an approach based on individuals and individuals at the center of the planning process. So everything happens around the individual. And the individual will drive the planning for their lives. And this process actually will involve and encompass people like family, friends, professional supporters, whoever can actually help and assist that person in not only planning their life, but taking it forward in terms of short-term and long-term goals. Just to give a practical example of this, some years ago now, I worked with a profoundly autistic young woman, and she had no verbal communication skills. She lived in a residential home with among 12 other people, and her life had really, for some years, been pretty much the same thing every day, doing the same things every day. And we actually used the person-centered planning process in developing her life going forward. Well, what we knew about this young lady was that she loved the colour pink. She loved anything pink. So we decided we'd start the process by having a party and inviting all the people who were close to her and that she would value being in the room with her during the process. And what did we do? We had pink balloons, we had pink drinks, we had pink puffs on the chairs, we had pink everything in the room. We had photographs of her all over the room. So the first thing was she knew that this was about her. She knew that it was her day. She walked into the room and there was everything pink. It was absolutely amazing to see her face with the big smile that came out. She immediately recognized this party was for her. As people came into the room, she greeted them, smiled, met them, took them to their seats. She was involved in the meeting right from the start. Without going into too much detail of how the planning happened, because we'll cover that later, just to give you the example, she came into that meeting leading a very dull life. By involving people around her who could make things happen for her, by the time she came out of that meeting, she'd got plans going forward. Now, within a very short time, within a period of a year or so, this young lady was sharing an apartment with one other person. She'd moved out of the 12-bed residential unit. She had her own car, which staff drove for her, but it was her car. She had voluntary work. She was starting to do voluntary work in charity shops in the area. And she had lots of leisure activities that people were supporting her, like dance, like yoga, things that she wanted to do with her leisure time. So her life completely changed as a result of the person-centered planning process. And there are many, many more we could quote, but as we go through the training, I will be referring to different cases that I've been involved with. So why do we need PCP? We need to consider the person-centered planning approach, specifically in autism, and specifically with autism spectrum conditions because of its design. So instead of starting from a pre-existing plan that's in place and the person and we as professionals have to work to the plan, what we're going to do is adapt the plan so that it's actually tailored to the individual and to their individual needs. So there's a big shift here in where we're coming from in developing what we're doing. We all have transitions in our lives. We all go through transitions, and they occur for all of us in day-to-day life. So we don't think too much about that, from going from home to school, or school to somebody else's house, or to a club, or wherever it is we're going. All of these are transitions. All of these are times when we go from one place or one activity to another. And most of us do that without any great effort. As long as we know where we've got to go, when we've got to go, and who we've got to go with, how to get there, then it's not too much of a problem. For people with autism spectrum conditions, this can be a big problem because every transition actually is change. And things that people with autism spectrum conditions do often struggle to cope with change. So even a small transition can be a big problem for people on the autism continuum. We think about long-term transitions, and the long-term transitions that we all meet in our lives, and changes that occur. Things like changing schools, going from lower school to upper school. Things like going from school to university or college, or leaving school to go into a job or vocational training. Moving house, moving country for some people, we've just been talking about. So these are things that we all experience. And yes, we may become anxious, we may become worried about it because it's a big change, but we cope. People with autism spectrum conditions will find that very difficult to not only imagine the change that's going to happen and be able to put themselves ahead to see what's coming next and imagine that, but also to get through the stages that come with transition. So ideally, the person-centered planning process will provide people with the tools to help to plan those changes in life. And it will help them to navigate the difficulties with that change and to identify the people who can support them through changes. So it's not just about transitions for these individuals. The person-centered planning process is about everything in your life, and actually having a blueprint for where you're going with situations in your life. That might be leisure, it might be work, it might be living situations, transport, whatever. Anything can be included within the person-centered planning process. Now, if we think about the history and where we've come from, the person-centered theory is that it is non-directive or Rogerian. And it's a theory that comes from the field of psychological therapy and was developed by Carl Rogers back in the 1940s. So it's not necessarily new, but it's developed over time. PCP was named as person-centered planning and described for the first time in the 1980s as such by a series of scientists in the United States and also Canada, with its biggest advocate being John O'Brien, who really drove the whole process forward. Some developments were seen around the end of the century when PCP developed beyond the first local approaches and started to be considered and developed on a wider and global scale. So over time, it caught on. Over time, people started to pick up on this as an idea and a concept which they could take forward. little motorbike going by there. Let's just acknowledge that it was there. Okay, let's not worry, it's live, it happens. And then in the 1990s, we accelerated with person-centered planning, and an increasing number of organisations, of clinicians and professionals have applied these practices to different situations and created their own procedures around PCP, and further variants have therefore emerged over time. The current status quo for PCP sees a strong emphasis on the empowerment of individuals, paired with a great flexibility, and this is the key, is to be flexible and to think flexibly, as the plan gets designed around that person and developed around that person. So we're starting 1980s. Let's go back to 1980s. Oh, sorry. So this was about person futures planning, personal futures. 24-hour planning for the first time, to actually look at a 24-hour person, because we don't just live in one slice of our lives. We live 24 hours a day, and one thing leads to another. Work leads on to home, home leads on to leisure. So for the first time, we start to think about designing individual programs for people. And then in 1985, the new HATS system, and we developed the MAPS, which is mapping out somebody's life, and also families first. So starting to involve families rather than everything being clinically driven and professionally driven. This led to essential lifetime planning in the 1990s, which also included people's personal histories and the pathway that comes from the map. So we're looking at the pathway through life, and the path is now part of the person-centered planning process. So how do we go about this? How do we build a person-centered plan? There are 5 main steps to build a person-centered plan. And they all evolve around the centrality of the person being at the centre, the individual being the person who drives the process, so that we're aiming to make people more independent and more in control of their own lives and more self-realised. So the 5 steps: the participants at the centre, family and friends are planning collaborators, and they're talking about what's important for that individual. Plan helps the person to become part of a community. Often these people historically have been shut out of communities or shut away from communities. What we're saying here is this person has the right to be part of the community, right to be part of the culture around them. And what we're going to do through the process is to help to bring them into the community and make them valued members of society. And also the plan stays alive. This is a key issue as well. We don't just do a plan and then walk away and forget about it. The plan must be regularly reviewed. The plan must be regularly overseen and tweaked and adjusted depending on the person's individual needs at the time. So if we look at who can draft a plan, well, a qualified professional PCP facilitator can involve a group of people in putting the plan together. And that will include very much the individual at the centre. The word facilitator means somebody who encourages and enables people to take part. If you're looking at training facilitators, any sort of facilitators, that's what they do. They don't stand there and teach, they don't tell, they bring people together. And this is why the people who lead PCP processes in the first instance will be known as facilitators, because it's their job to bring the circle of friends together around the individual and to involve them in the process. If we look at the values of person-centered planning, the main values and objectives are empowerment, independence, and communication. And this is in order to help and integrate the individual into society.